Mind. The Lowell Institute Cooperative Broadcasting Council presents Allen Tate, the poet as creator. Essay number 6 in the National Association of Educational Broadcasters series, The Creative Mind, produced by WGBH-FM in Boston under a grant from the Educational Television and Radio Center. These conversations explore the creative process as it pertains to the American artist and scientist in the 20th century. And here is our host and commentator for The Creative Mind, Lyman Bryson.
I suppose it isn't unreasonable to expect that poets and critics, Mr. Allen Tate is both poet and critic, should be able to talk about their work better than most creative artists or thinkers. After all, they deal in words. Words are their business. But this doesn't mean, as Mr. Tate makes it perfectly clear, that a poet is a writer who has a good idea, something that happens to him, and he takes this raw material and sort of fits it into the rhythms and the rhymes that make a poem. Now, if there is such a thing as the raw material of a poem, it's a chunk of human experience. It's like the raw material of any other form of art. It's elusive, it's charged with emotion, it's very vague in its outlines. What the poet does, and the critic in Mr. Tate here, is watching the poet in himself at work. What the poet does is to make a poem out of this experience, but it isn't really all there until it is a poem. The poem says something which couldn't be said except in that particular form. Now, what generates a poem in the mind of a poet may be most anything. It may be a line which has come into his fancy somehow and whose echo sort of fascinates him. It may be a vision that he has of something. It may be an actual sensory experience. Whatever it is, it works like a piece of sand in an oyster. And finally you get the pearl, which is the poetic or the artistic form. He's trying not so much to make something as to discover something. And when he discovers it, he knows that it's right. This argument, which is a little bit more subtle perhaps than makes it too subtle to be easily comprehended unless we stop to think about it and experiment in our own psychologies with it a little bit, leads to another topic of special interest to Mr. Tate. He's a teacher and a critic as well as a poet. Now, he doesn't see any difficulty in being a critic and a poet at the same time. After all, most of the great poets of the world have been good critics when they wanted to turn to prose. One can think of a great many of them who took the trouble to be critics. Mr. Tate's also a teacher and a poet. Now, being a teacher and a poet presents quite a different kind of problem. But we have in our civilization at the present time a great many examples of men who are trying to be teachers as well as musicians, teachers as well as painters. And the reason for this is that the agency of patronage in our civilization seems to be, more and more as time goes on, the university. The university provides a home for the poet or the painter. Of course, it's always been the favorite home of the critic. The university provides a place where he can work. It provides him with a livelihood. Now, the question is, does it also give him his special contact with life? Or by being inside a university, is he cut off from the kind of contact with life that would give his poetry freshness and vitality? Mr. Tate believes that there is in our country at the present time an enormous amount of amateur verse writing, just as there's an enormous amount of painting. I suppose no country in the world ever had more active amateurs in all the arts right now than the people of the United States have. We paint on Sundays and other days. We write music, we play music, and as he says, we write verse. And yet, this is the paradox, a rather troublesome one, at the present time there doesn't seem to be in the United States any very great appreciation of poetry in its highest reaches. We all want to write poetry, but Mr. Tate suspects that we don't want to listen to it with any great devotion. Now, if he's right in thinking this, he also gives us a hint as to the answer. And that is that poets have visions of the world not as it is, but as it ought to be, or as it might be. And when we get a vision of the world as it ought to be, we're a little bit disturbed because the people in that vision don't seem to be like us, and we think perhaps the poet isn't painting our portraits quite as faithfully as he might. It raises a very old question. I doubt very much if the contemporaries of Walt Whitman recognized themselves easily in the robust virility that he attributed to Americans, just as today perhaps we don't recognize our rather sad selves in the poetry of T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden, or men of that kind, or even of Mr. Tate himself. And that leaves us with the very ancient question, which is our real self, what we think we are, or what the artist sees in us. Mr. Cavness began the conversation with Mr. Tate with a question about the relation between the poet and his life, his actual experience.
I should think your question would be answered in many different ways, as many different ways as there are poets. There are certain parts of one's experience that seem not to be available in poetry. There's very little of my direct experience. I should think in any of the poems I've written, somehow after many years, an occasion, an experience, or something I've seen or felt, or some muddle or confusion that I suffered at one time in my life, all those things seem somehow to get involved in a kind of symbolic movement of the mind, certain images, and then a poem gets written, but the original experience seems to be lost or so disguised that I can scarcely recognize it.
Then projected knowledge, or knowledge growing from the imagination, is just as valid as actual knowledge or experience.
Yes, but I think we would have to say there that the validity somewhat depends upon the coherence. A madman, a man in a psychiatric ward would have the same kind of validity in his experience. It's real, but it's not necessarily poetry.
Well, isn't one of the major problems of the poet in translating this experience, whether it's actual or springing from the imagination, into poetic terms?
I think it is, and I should think that couldn't be calculated by the poet. The result in language is a part an expression of his character and intelligence, his sensibility, and these obscure things that come out of the recesses of the psyche somehow. But if it's a conscious control always, it seems to me it'll end up will give rather bad results.
How does one determine the metrical structure of a poem, the meter and rhythm and so forth? Does the subject matter dictate this metrical
It certainly does, partly, I should think. But if it governs it entirely, then the meter or the rhythm would be absolutely chaotic. Isn't it true that in most ages that there are certain metrical conventions that seem to dominate, and poets either accept them wholly or partly or tend to reject them? But it seems to me there's always a rather subtle interaction between the prevailing rhythms of a poetic age and the inner demands of the subject. There's a constant pushing of both ways. The meter's trying to subdue the intractable subject matter, and the intractable subject matter is trying to break down the meter. I should think the great poetry, like some of Shakespeare's, reflects that conflict. The late Shakespearean blank verse, for example. But again, we have so many variables, it's almost impossible to deal with them coherently.
Does this rhythmic metrical push ever occur first, prior to the real idea or image?
Well, I think it does. Just a rhythm gets into your head, and certain sounds are associated with that rhythm. We kind of jabberwocky occasionally. I remember many years ago when Hart Crane was writing one of his most beautiful poems called Passage. It was at a 4th of July party, and everybody was feeling very high, and Hart began to repeat, say over and over again, where the cedar leaf divides the sky, where the cedar leaf divides the sky. And I'm sure he had no idea where that phrase was going, but about 2 months later he showed me the manuscript of the entire poem.
And that one phrase was the genesis.
That was the genesis, and I'm sure he had no idea what the subject or what was going to be in the poem. It just, one thing led to another.
Is it possible that a poet feels at home, at ease within certain metric patterns and not in others?
I think if he gets to feel too much at ease in any of them, he better beware. I suppose that in writing a poem, or painting a picture, or composing a quartet, that the so-called creative man is trying to discover something. He doesn't know what the quartet is going to be about. The painter doesn't quite know what the picture. He paints the picture in order to find out what the picture is going to be. Likewise with the poet.
I was just going to say, it's the same thing true in the construction of a poem.
Yes.
Speaking of the subject area of a poem, where does a poet find his symbolism? The symbolism that he employs, does he have a personal language of symbolism?
I should think so, but where he gets it is a difficult matter to decide. Some of it is consciously acquired, and that's what we call I should think, generally speaking, the culture in which the poet lives. He's exploring his own mind for certain symbols or images which will convey to himself even the meaning of the particular situation in history in which he finds himself. But where these symbols come from, nobody quite knows. It seems to me probably the most profound thing ever said about poetry was not said directly about poetry. It was about something else. It was in the gravedigger scene in Hamlet. When the gravedigger tosses up Yorick's skull, Hamlet is a little shocked by that, being a very sensitive man. He thinks it's pretty horrible that the gravedigger can play with the skull of his friend so recently dead. And Horatio says, "Custom, my lord, hath made it in him a property of easiness." And when the poet is so completely saturated or completely involved in his symbolism that he doesn't feel it consciously, it seems to me that the symbolism is much more powerful.
Well, that brings me then directly to the next aspect of this question, and that is, how can a poet evolve symbols that at once have meaning for his readers and at the same time are original in usage or in concept?
Seems to me that's a matter of luck. Some of the poets, the social poets of the 30s and early 1940s, were trying to evolve consciously certain symbols for their time. Well, some of it was pretty good, no doubt, but I can't believe that this conscious search for symbols is ever going to work. It seems to me the poet has got to be possessed by his symbols. He doesn't possess them. They take hold of him.
Does the poet work as directly and obviously with rhythmic structure as, say, a musician does?
Well, I think probably he does, but again, like the musician, he's not only working with rhythm. Well, take the musician first. The musician not only working with rhythm, he's working with sound also, and pitch, and the relation of certain notes. So the poet is not working with pure rhythm. It's always involved in the certain sounds, and those sounds become further involved with meanings. It seems to me at that point the art of poetry moves away from the pure arts of sound like music, or the pure arts of visual arts like painting and sculpture. We can't completely take all the meaning out of language as some of the surrealist poets attempted to do. It seems to me that a first-rate poet, when he produces a line or a passage, he's not too conscious of any one of these elements. They all move together. It's what T.S. Eliot has called the auditory imagination. It's not to be separated from the meaning of the words. It's the only analogy I can think of is that, for example, if you hear a good violinist play the Joachim cadenzas to the Beethoven concerto. Now, it's certainly true that at one time the violinist must have played each note separately. But when he plays it in public, he's not aware of each note separately. If he were, he couldn't play it. The whole thing is muscular memory, intellectual memory. The whole thing is involved as a complex, and you can't separate the different elements.
And all of these elements have to be brought into play, of course.
Yes, yes.
Getting away a little bit from the musical aspect as a parallel with poetry. How about the parallels between poetry and painting? Are there any such? Does, for example, a poet employ texture the way a painter does?
Well, I'm sure he does. But we have that word texture pretty firmly established in what is called the new criticism. John Crowe Ransom, many years ago, developed a theory of the relation of the logical content of the poem to the sensibility, and he used the two terms, structure and texture. The texture is the unpredictable or contingent element, the thing that you couldn't predict if you have just a logical paraphrase of the poem. And I suppose that would be roughly similar to what you have in mind when you speak of the texture of painting. But the direct connection between painting and poetry seems to me a very difficult thing to understand. It seems to me, generally speaking, that painting, well, everybody knows this is a spatial art, and it must push as far as possible towards the temporal to give the sequence of action somehow. Quite oppositely, poetry is an art of temporal sequence. But in order to give the reader that this temporal sequence, this action, whatever it is located somewhere, it must create the illusion of space. So the two arts are moving towards each other and meet somewhere in the middle.
Does the fact that we're living in what we might describe as a rather strongly critical age, does this act as a deterrent to the poet, or is it perhaps a spur?
It's hard to decide that. I think that it acts as a deterrent in some respects. In the American universities today, you'll find young men and women, 20 to 25 years old, who are extremely knowing. They've read all the criticism, they know all the answers, and they're so much aware of what has been accomplished by the two preceding generations that they tend to be intimidated by it. And
they know so clearly what's going on that they can't write themselves?
Yes, there's something in that. Or if they do write, they tend to, well, as I say, to be intimidated, and don't strike out on their own very much. It's a certain kind of ignorance of one's own time is probably an advantage in a way to any artist. I don't suggest that any artist ought to be ignorant, but if he's too much aware of his contemporaries, it creates a kind of nervousness. They all get jittery about it. And
well, how about the case that might very well be identified with your own, the poet who is also a critic? Does your activity as a critic have any direct effect on your activity as a poet?
It's very hard for me to know that. I've tried to think about it a little. It would be inevitable. One would think about it, but I don't think there's much connection. I should think most of my essays are programmatic. That is, I'm trying in devious and indirect ways to rationalize or to justify what I've written. I have to be perfectly candid about it. And I would go further and say that I don't think I'm very different from other people. Most literary critics are programmatic critics. The best example of that in our century is T.S. Eliot, whose early essays established a certain atmosphere in which his own poetry could be read. It seems to me that Coleridge did exactly the same thing, not necessarily for himself, but he created a critical atmosphere in which the romantic poetry could be appreciated, and criticism has always got to do that.
The whole age, then, the whole era in poetry existed within this atmosphere.
I would think so.
Well, then, in that case, we could say that, at least in some cases, it's a help to have the critical faculties sharpened.
I would think so, yes. If I may refer to my own situation again, I should think I've lost count. I've written so many essays. I should think all but 2 or 3 of them were written at the request of somebody. And my span of attention in essays is about 6,000 words. I don't think I could ever write a complete book. And somebody gave me the subject and said, well, see what you can do with it. And I think a great many people are like that. They're critics by accident.
Does then the writing of critical material, these critical essays, exist on a creative level equal to poetry?
I don't know about that. I just have no real opinion. It's certainly different from poetry. I should think that if a writer of verse doesn't keep the verse rather separate from the critical writing, he's going to get into trouble because he's going to write poetic prose otherwise. It seems to me that the critical style, the prose style for a critic ought to be extremely plain, just the barest and perhaps the least interesting possible language. There are no poetic effects.
We mentioned earlier the breaking of rules as a means of breaking ground. Isn't it perhaps possible for the poet, who is also a critic, to break his own rules, to even contradict himself?
Very much so. You mean to contradict what he's doing in verse and
to construct poetry that perhaps does not agree with what he has said in critical essays?
I think it often happens all the time. In fact, T.S. Eliot is, again, T.S. Eliot illustrates so many things in our age. The neoclassical or the classical ideal in his criticism is certainly not embodied in his poetry. He's a romantic poet, and one of the great romantic poets.
Well, that leads me directly into another subject area entirely. The poet and the critic both fitting into their own age, their own period of time, and that is the relationship between the poet and the society in which he lives. It seems to me that, to a certain extent, the serious poet is somewhat separated from his society, or at least the attitude of his society toward him would indicate this. Would there possibly be less of this separation, if you agree that it exists, if more people practiced the writing of poetry, no matter how amateurish they were about it? Would there be a more direct and participating attitude?
I don't think so, really, because it seems to me that in the United States there must be more poets per capita than there have ever been before in the world. In fact, everybody's writing poetry. There are poetry societies, ladies' clubs who write, the ladies write poetry all the time. I don't know how it'd be very interesting if we could possibly find out how many verse writers there are in the United States. I should think there must be at least 200,000. But they all tend to, they don't tend to make a poetic community.
Even with all of these verse writers, it occurs to me that it's become almost a cliche in the publishing business that a book of verse, a book of poetry is something to take a long, careful look at because it may be a dangerous venture financially.
Yes, I think a very good sale for a new book of poems would be 1,000.
And in terms of the bestseller list, that's rather modest, isn't it?
Rather modest. The publishers lose money on it. They do it occasionally for prestige or because they're genuinely interested in poetry. This question of the relation of the Poetry Society is a very difficult one. Archibald MacLeish has been, as you know, very much interested in it, and he's concerned with what he calls public philosophy for the poet. But I think the trouble with that approach to the matter is that the poet tends to project a public philosophy into society of which society itself is unaware. We get that going back to Whitman, as a matter of fact. Whitman is the great democratic poet, and the great democratic poet is read only by highbrows. And it's a curious fact that in this great democratic world of Whitman, there's only one human being. No other human beings exist except by illusion. The only human being Whitman himself. So that's a very dangerous thing. I should think that the extent to which a poet is nourished by society, well, that whole matter is beyond his control. He either is or he isn't, but he cannot create that relation. I like the rather paradoxical and extreme statement of W.H. Auden. He says poetry doesn't make anything happen. Well, we know it does in a way. It doesn't make anything happen immediately. And I should think the poet had better just forget about that. If he's isolated from society, he's got to accept the situation.
Is the most vital function of the poet, then, creating a new way of seeing old things or creating new things to see?
Both, I would think.
On an equal basis?
Depends on the poet. Depends on the poet. It's often said that the poet makes us see common things as if they'd never been looked at before, and we got a good deal of that in Robert Frost. It's one of his great merits. It seems to me that even an innovator like Pound, and to some extent Eliot, who's a little less of an innovator, after a little while they don't seem quite so strange, that they're not really pointing out new things or showing us new things so much as the old things and with a new sensibility.
We have been discussing from time to time the younger poets, the coming generation of poets. Is it possible to teach the writing of poetry?
No, I shouldn't think so.
I know that a great many universities, colleges have poets in residence who actually teach courses in the writing of poetry.
I happen to be one of them. And
well, how successful is this fostering of poetry through a classroom?
Well, we have to wait a long time to see how they all turn out. I should think that the virtue of that kind of teaching is simply that a gifted poet might be saved a little time by having some older person talk to him about what he's doing, or to encourage him, or perhaps to tell him to stop writing poetry and to go into the oil business or something of that sort. You can't teach it. It simply seems to me that since American society seems to be rather indifferent to poetry, American society as a whole, the universities become the patron. And it creates a center of relative leisure in which the young poet can try himself to see what he can do.
You were speaking of patronage, the university functioning nowadays as in the role of a patron. Is there anything nowadays comparable to the personal patronage that was enjoyed by, say, the Elizabethan Restoration?
Well, there are isolated examples of it, but I shouldn't think it would be characteristic of our age. The great foundations are patrons of the arts, and the sciences, too. I should think the trouble with that kind of patronage is that it is impersonal and abstract. It gives the artist certain advantages. He's a little more independent than if he were a retainer of a nobleman in Renaissance Italy. And yet there are certain losses. He is given a certain amount of money to go to Europe or to retire somewhere to paint a picture or write a poem. His isolation is even more complete than if he hadn't received the money, because if he hadn't received the money, he'd have to work for a living. That would somehow relate him to the society in which he's living, which he finds himself in.
Then, speaking, as it were, of pushing a society forward, making it progress by one's writing, to whom is the poet really responsible? Is he responsible to his society, only to himself?
I should think the ideal situation, which of course has never existed, would be that in which the poet, in being responsible to himself, was automatically responsible to his society also.
Allen Tate, the poet as creator. Conversation number 6 in a series exploring the creative process as it pertains to the American artist and scientist in the 20th century. Host for The Creative Mind, Lyman Bryson. Producer for the series, Jack D. Summerfield, with William Cavness and Nadja Eisenberg as production associates. Next week, Ben Shawn, the painter as creator. The Creative Mind is produced and recorded by WGBH-FM in Boston for the National Association of Educational Broadcasters under a grant from the Educational Television and Radio Center.
This program was distributed by the National Educational Radio Network.